Greetings, friends. So today I thought, as I promised a few times ago, that we could talk about some books. And people asked me maybe I could do something on books about education, which I plan on doing. Now, I'm probably very qualified to talk about this because I've taught everything from kindergarten through university, and also home. I didn't do as much as my wife, but involved in homeschooling with some of my own kids, and so I was a Waldorf teacher for 16 years, and for at least maybe half of that time, I was a Waldorf master teacher, meaning I would train other teachers, taught in teacher training programs. I was a mentor. I mentored a lot of beginning teachers or teachers in training, and I would fly all over the country to watch students teach their practicum and give them feedback, that kind of stuff. So I know a lot about teaching, and I did the same thing when I was in teaching college. When I first started, one of my first jobs teaching college was I ran the writing center at a liberal arts college, and the reason they asked me to do that is because they wanted me to work with the tutors, who are all people who, not just tutors, but also some of the adjuncts, who are all people with degrees, but they were new to teaching. And so I mentored them as well. So, I have a lot of experience teaching. And I thought I would do this. But I have a lot of experience teaching, but I hate the educational establishments, plural. But I'm allowed to because I know it from the inside. There's a few things I thought we could talk about. Now, you may or may not know this, and so kind of full disclosure right up front. When I was a teacher, I was a Waldorf teacher, and so I certainly know more about Waldorf teaching than other kinds, though I did teach in education programs in college, so I know what was going on in public schools in particular at the time, which wasn't that long ago, and so I'm sure it's still going on. So I'll start with Rudolf Steiner, about what books from him are good for teaching. Now, I would say that all of Rudolf Steiner's books on education are worth reading. And if you've tried to read Steiner before, you might have started with occult science or theosophy or knowledge of higher worlds, which are all thick, dense, esoteric texts. And when you first read them, like, I don't know this language. But it's not so with his books on teaching and education, nor his books on any practical things like beekeeping or agriculture. They're much easier to understand than his other work. So if that's intimidating to you, don't be intimidated. There's still going to be some esoteric stuff in there, but it's not as impenetrable to the newbie as some of his other works. Now, I just have a few of them in my hand. I have a bunch of them, but I think I've given a lot of them away. The first one I want to talk about is Study of Man. Now, the reason this is important, it's kind of a theoretical text, but the way Steiner started Waldorf education is Emil Molt, who ran the Waldorf cigarette factory in Stuttgart, after World War I, he said, "Dr. Steiner, we can't let this happen again. Can you come up with the kind of education for the children of my workers?" Can you imagine this? That would create the kind of society that we need going forward. And so basically Steiner's like, hold my beer. And he came up with this thing almost overnight, this method and philosophy of teaching, which is just brilliant, really. I know I'm biased, but it is brilliant. Study of Man is really some of it's the lectures from 1919. That it's, how many lectures is it? 15 or something? It's 14 lectures on that he gave as kind of the background to this theory to the first teachers in the first school. So this is like one of the seminal documents, as they say. There was two other books which I think I must have given away, maybe to my daughter who was a Waldorf teacher. called Practical Advice to Teachers and Discussions with Teachers. And they might have different names now. I don't know. But when I was started to become a teacher, this is, and I was being apprenticed at a Waldorf school in Detroit. There was no teacher training at the time, so I got these 3 books, read them in the sequence that they were delivered. Because what happened, Study of Man, I think, was the morning lecture. Then the afternoon they had another lecture. Then they had another lecture, and the other 2 lectures series were from Practical Advice to Teachers and Discussions with Teachers. So I read those kind of as they were delivered to those original teachers, which is really a useful thing. Of course, it doesn't teach you how to do it necessarily, but at least you know what's being done. And there's actually a really good, I think it's well done, documentary out there, not just about Waldorf's education, but about Steiner's work in general. It's called The Challenge of Rudolf Steiner. It's got some great insights from Waldorf education there. You'll be able to see what they do. And I'm not trying to make a commercial for Waldorf education because I'm pissed off at Waldorf education right now because it got woke. Okay? Nevertheless, the template that Steiner threw out there over 100 years ago is well worth your time to look at about how to reimagine education. All right, and the next one, this he gave later in his career, almost a year before he died, Curative Education, which is kind of what we would call special ed. What do you do with the kids who have problems with this or that? And he's got a lot of, and the thing is with all of his education stuff, it's very practical. And it's so practical, but it's kind of thing you say, wow, how come I didn't think of that? Why isn't anybody doing that? It's so obvious that's what you should do. And he's very attentive to the development of the child. He would call it the incarnation of the child, but the development of the child. And I've talked about that in other videos. Now, just a couple others, these would be good to get because they're short. The Essentials of Education and the Roots of Education. Well worth your time. Now, if you probably know this, but maybe if you don't, Waldorf education is not just a content-rich education. It's got a really rich curriculum, but it's also rich in the arts and in the practical arts, in the fine arts and the practical arts. So children from the beginning learn how to play the recorder, and there are lots of different reasons for that. I mean, just being acclimated to music, but also to regulate the breath, because if a child breathes properly, anxiety comes from not breathing, right? Or not breathing deeply enough. So there's the fine arts, children make their own books, their own textbooks. They don't have textbooks. They make their own textbooks. Comes out of their own being. So there's a lot of drawing and artistic work and dictation and a lot of story. I mean, it's a story-rich environment. I'm sure my friend Martin Shaw would probably loves Waldorf education. We never talked about it, but I'm sure he does. So that's you'd have to, if you want to find out more, maybe find out more. And maybe I'll do another video on Waldorf education sometime. I could talk about it forever. But it's definitely worth your time. Now, the next one I want to talk about, next book, and I have mentioned this before, I think. At least I mentioned it on the Regeneration podcast. But The Educated Mind, How Cognitive Tools Shape Our Understanding by Kieran Egan. Now, Kieran Egan was an Irish educational guy who taught at Simon Fraser University in Canada. British Columbia, I'm not sure exactly where it is. And he reimagined education because he was convinced that the way we were doing education with these, the conflicting commitments of education to either socialization or letting the child's wisdom rule, guide how things go, or the kind of Platonic, or we could call it a traditional classical education model. Those are all in conflict with each other because if the job of a school is socialization, so you're going to find out how many genders there are nowadays, or back in the day, you It all starts with the Pledge of Allegiance, standing in line, waiting to go to the bathroom. Those are all socialization. You have to know all this stuff about whatever the country you are in, right? That the government wants you to know. So that's very much a socialization model. But you can't have that if you have a content-rich Platonic model, classical model, which the idea is to have a well-informed individual who can make independent decisions. I mean, you can't have an independent thinker and socialized at the same time. It just doesn't go. And on the other hand, with he points to Rousseau and trusting the child's innate wisdom. That doesn't work with either of those other two models either. So he calls them three bad ideas, and then he has a new one. And I like his new idea. It's very compatible with the Waldorf model. He calls it different kinds of understanding that children process through and not just children, but into adulthood. So the first one, which he doesn't spend a lot of time on, he calls it somatic understanding, meaning the understanding of the body. So you see this with children, with learning, how they learn to roll over or lift their head or how to nurse. Those are things that are pre-verbal that they learn, right? That are in the body. But if you don't know this, I mean, kids who don't get some of those lessons properly, like maybe they skip crawling and go straight to walking, or they miss some of those benchmarks. Those are kids who are actually, those are indicators that those kids might have learning disabilities later. So it's really important for kids to hit all those benchmarks as they go through development. And so Egan talks about somatic understanding, but he's more interested in what happens once they get to school. And the first kind of understanding he calls mythic understanding. Even though John Dewey, horrible theorist that he was, thinks, children don't need imaginative kinds of things. He's like, but Kieran's like, anybody who spent 5 minutes with your kid knows that they use their imaginations, and we know how easily they believe in the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus. They're just in that mythic world, right? So he says, well, why wouldn't you use that if they're there already? So he, and this is very much what happens in a Waldorf school, especially in the lower grades. Myths and fairy tales are used to impart knowledge about the world, and also to introduce the rudiments of learning the ABCs, for instance, or counting. Very much done in a story manner, not an intellectual manner, not a head-centered manner. It's the body's involved. So that's Egan's first, and I'm just kind of going quickly through this. Again, I could do a whole thing on this. His second stage after mythic, so somatic, mythic, I guess the third stage we'll say, is romantic understanding. And romantic understanding for Egan, and if you've spent any time teaching school, this is true. He points to like the middle grade, say later 4th to 9th grade, that the kids are interested in, mega ergon, the great achievements. And I know this from my own kids, and I know this from teaching school, where the kids really get into, say, for instance, baseball records. Like, who was the best? Who was the fastest? Right? Who had the most home runs? Or they also, are interested in the great achievements. Like, one thing that really worked like a charm in 5th grade in a Waldorf school was the story of Alexander the Great, which is like this kind of heroic figure who, unfortunately is also a tragic figure, but a heroic figure who does things that nobody else had dared to do, right? Which, I remember we had so many conversations over the dinner table when my older boys were middle school age about the Iliad and who's better, Achilles or Hector? Who's the better guy? Who's the better guy? And they're like, well, Achilles is because he beat Hector. And then there's like, no, Hector's a good man because he did this for his family, right? And he was noble. He was more noble. And if you know the Iliad, Achilles is a big baby. Even though he's the best quarterback on the football team, he is a big baby. And there were these boys, every couple of months, they'd come into my desk. Mr. Mark, we got to talk to you. I said, what is it? We have to know. We have to know. I said, what is it? Who's better, Batman or Superman? I'm like, well, I don't know, guys. It's an important topic. I gotta say, what do you guys think? And that's the thing when you're teaching. You never try to give them an answer. You push them. Well, what do you think? And they would get into this debate right in front of me about why Batman's better or why Superman's better. And then eventually, I think after a year or so of that, I told them I thought Batman was better because he didn't have superpowers, so he had to figure things out. But it was funny. It was the kids like, I told you, man, I told you. After romantic understanding, and actually there are other things, the love of language and, sweeping sagas of history and whatever, right? Those really appeal to kids, and I know this from experience. But after that, and this is like later high school, he talks about philosophic understanding, which is, when kids about that age and into college start to they want to find a system, right? I need to find a philosophy of life, right? So you'll see kids going through like 16 years old. Usually you see it where all of a sudden I'm a feminist. Right, and everything's about feminism. They see everything through the feminist lens, or they're a socialist, or a Marxist, or they're a capitalist. Whatever they are, they see everything through that lens, right? Which is, that's how to try to make sense of the world. I remember also kids get into like the occult or witchcraft, right? And I used to work at a bookstore back in the 80s. That's where I met my wife, and. At certain times of the year, at 3:15, because we were right down the street from a high school, we look at the clock and say, "Uh-oh, attack of the 16-year-old witches," and the 16-year-old witches would come in. They got their whole scarf thing on and long earrings and stars and moons and whatever, and they would all go into the occult section, look at the witchcraft books, and then, one time one girl gave me a maple leaf as she was leaving, and I was kind of beautiful at the time. I was young, and they left, and my wife, we weren't married yet, but the girls I was working with, my wife and these other two women, went to the witchcraft books and to see what maple leaf means, and I think it meant, I don't know, some kind of they was trying to do some charm on me. So what Egan says when students are at that level, it's the job of the teacher not to challenge them like in a bad way, but just bring up anomalies like, oh yeah, well, what about this? Right? Or like, say if you're dealing with a 17-year-old Marxist, you go, well, what? Yeah, Marx had some good points there. But what about when actually Marxist economies get implemented? What about that? Oh, well, that's and you could do the same thing in college. And then after that, which she doesn't get into as much, he talks about ironic understanding, and he uses Socrates as the example for that. Meaning, what Socrates' job, right, which kind of like the teacher does, is challenge assumptions. Now, I've talked about this for a lot on the podcast I do with Mike Sauter, the Regeneration podcast, and on there we talked about Jordan Peterson when he first appeared on the scene. And somebody asked me to write an article about him. I said, okay, I'll check him out. And I checked him out. And I'm like, why is this a controversy? He sounds like a normal professor to me. And we're the same generation. And a professor's job is precisely that, to challenge assumptions that students might have. Not to attack the students, but do like, well, what about this? Have you ever thought about this? Maybe that's not a good idea, right? Unfortunately, doesn't work that way. Now, the next thing I want to talk about, I can't believe I already went to 20 minutes. You might have heard of this. Charlotte Mason, home education. This is first of a five book series. Charlotte Mason. She was old, long time ago. This book was published in 1935. So it's old. And she's brilliant because and there's a lot to learn from this. I mean, I know there are Charlotte Mason, educators out there. we have the books. My wife uses a lot of Charlotte Mason stuff with the kids, especially when they're little, kindergarten, first grade. But here's what she says. I love this. Nature knowledge, the most important for young children. That's a direct quote. It would be well if all we persons in authority, parents and all who act for parents, could make up our minds that there is no sort of knowledge to be got in these early years so valuable to children as that which they get for themselves of the world they live in. Let them once get touch with nature, and a habit is formed, which will be a source of delight through life. And absolutely true. I mean, she's got many other things too that are very practical, practical things with the hands that children can do. But starting with nature, so many kids these days, and I originally taught in the city, their experience of nature is mediated through screens. Like I had one boy, nicest kid, smartest kid, but he didn't have actual experience of nature. He had experience of the Nature Channel. So I'd talk about snakes, and he'd go, "Yeah, I saw this on the Nature Channel," but he didn't know what a snake was. So I would take the kids out into nature, whether it was on a field trip or on a camping trip, and actually handle snakes. Or one time we caught a whole bunch of newts. This one time on a camping trip, and one boy actually caught a shrew, which I couldn't believe he caught a shrew because shrews are mean. It didn't bite him, so he must have had a gift. So Charlotte Mason, her home education series is really a good one. Now this is my Bible when it comes to teaching. What am I doing here? Anne of Green Gables. Check that out, huh? Now, by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Why is this such a good book? For lots of reasons. One reason is because Lucy Montgomery was herself a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse kind of situation in New Brunswick, I think. And Anne Shirley, the heroine of Anne of Green Gables, is a child of romantic understanding. In fact, I used to teach a course for people it was a graduate course, so it was a course for people who were either in the classroom already and seeking a master's degree, or who were seeking a master's degree without been in a classroom yet. And I made them read this, and they said, why? I said, because it's a teaching manual. Because the things you see Anne do with her imagination, and how the love of language and story appeals to her, those are the secret weapons of the teacher at that age. I'll never forget one time in 7th grade, I think it was, this boy was late for class every damn day. Like, not just a couple of minutes, like 20 minutes, half an hour. And one day I was telling the story of it was a poetry unit or a block, and I was telling the story of the death of Percy Shelley. And if you don't know this, Shelley died at sea, and his boat capsized during a storm, and he drowned. And after his body washed up on the shore, his friends asked for permission to take the body, but because of fear of cholera, the authorities wouldn't let them. This is in Italy. So they asked if they could burn the body on the shore, which they did. And as his body was finally almost all the way consumed and the chest kind of fell apart, his friend, I think was named Edmund Trelawney, reached into the corpse and took the heart out and wrapped it in his handkerchief and didn't let the authorities see. And I think the heart is at the Metropolitan Library, the New York Public Library, I think. I heard that. But anyway, I was telling this story, and this boy comes in just at the end of the story. He's like, "What happened? What happened?" Because that's such a captivating story. It's so romantic, but it just the images there speak so much to kids at that age, right? And yeah, I mean, this is just a phenomenal book as you see Anne and her love for language, and she says right here, she's really into her imagination. Anne was an orphan, and she says You know, when she arrives where she's going to be living, she says, yep, but there's so little scope for the imagination in an asylum. Right? She was in an orphan asylum, and my God, isn't that a perfect description of our own world? There's so little scope for imagination in an asylum, and we live in an asylum right now. So yeah, so really, I highly recommend Anne of Green Gables as a book to not only use as a tool for teaching children, but to give yourself hope about youth. It's enriching. Now here I'm going to get a little bit critical, hypercritical. Great book, Deschooling Society by Ivan Illich, or Ivan Illich. Came out in '68, I think. 1968. I was 5 when this book came out. Oh, it's 1970, a little bit later. 1970. That's about when I started school. I started first grade. I wish he would have started written this book earlier. This is highly critical of the whole system, right? And he's even got things in 1970 where he's talking about what a racket the textbook racket is, where it just, you know, it's basically using students as an ATM. And of my years in teaching college, that was the thing that outraged me the most, is how much textbooks cost. And I would find the cheapest books. You know, I was lucky. I was an English professor. You can get, you know, novels or books of poetry for relatively cheap. But the sciences and math books, they're like $200 or more. Even you know, it's ridiculous. And they can't be resold because it's a racket, and they keep updating the books so the kids can't resell it. It's abuse. And also, my experience of higher education was so depressing because it's not about the acquisition of wisdom, the seeking of truth, beauty, and goodness anymore. It's just not. Now, I think it's probably different in the sciences than in the humanities. But in the humanities, I wouldn't know. I don't know why Emily would go to school for the humanities anymore. It's just horrible. And here's what Ivan Illich was saying in 1970 about the university system at the time, and comparing it to history. Now, Illich was a radical. He was a Catholic priest, but he was about as radical as you can get, the way he thought about things. Here's what he wrote, what he said. The old university was a liberated zone for discovery and the discussion of ideas, both new and old. Yes. Masters and students gathered to read the text of other masters, now long dead, and the living words of the dead masters gave new perspective to the fallacies of the present day. The university was then a community of academic quest and endemic unrest. I love that. It's true. I mean, that's the ideal, right? But, right, in the modern university, this community has fled to the fringes. And this is 1970. Imagine what it's like now, where it meets in a pad, a professor's office, or the chaplain's quarters. The structural purpose of the modern university has little to do with the traditional quest. Since Gutenberg, the exchange of disciplined critical inquiry has, for the most part, moved from the chair into print. The modern university has forfeited its chance to provide a simple setting for encounters, which are both autonomous and anarchic, focused yet unplanned and ebullient, and has chosen instead to manage the process by which so-called research and instruction are produced. And it's even more the case now, but God bless him for writing this book. It was just a very brief touch on this book, but the whole thing is where you can tell it because mine's falling apart. But certainly worth your time. Now another one, I got 2 more books, I think, I want to talk about. This is Education at the Crossroads by Jacques Maritain. Now I am not a big Jacques Maritain guy. I mean, I'm not into neo-scholasticism at all. But he was interesting. I mean, I don't know when he died. It doesn't say. But this book was written, I believe, 1960, so it was before I was born. And he was seeing the need. Of course, they all were after World War One and World War Two. That, like we said with Steiner and Emil Molt, after World War One and World War Two, they were all. There was an earnestness about change. We need to society. This is crazy. This stuff we just let happen, and you see that in especially the psychoanalysis written in the middle part of the 20th century, like Freud in his book Civilization and His Discontents. Jung was dealing with this. Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning. All those, what do you do when you live in the abyss and you live in basically not a Hieronymus Bosch painting, which is basically what people have been dealing with. Now, in Maritain's book, it's kind of based on the kind of traditional Catholic scholastic model of the trivium and the quadrivium, but he changes it. And Maritain another thing I like about him was that he was not afraid to engage modern art and philosophy in not a snooty or dismissive way. I mean, he was a great example. He was good friends with the artist, poet, filmmaker Jean Cocteau, who was about as avant-garde as you get. And so Maritain was really interested in seeing what poetry had to say to us at that time and how we could move forward with it. Now, he was also, but in his model, and he's a very intellectual man. I mean, he's an egghead and a half. But in his model, it's not just doing head work like the trivium and the quadrivium. And as he says here, before giving a youth the rules of good style, I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong part. The importance of manual work accompanying the education of the mind during the high school and college training is more and more recognized. There is no place closer to man than a workshop, and the intelligence of a man is not only in his head, but in his fingers too. Something that Steiner saw as well. And nice to see that. And there are some kind of classical Christian colleges, or Catholic colleges in particular, and high schools, I think, I'm not really too plugged into it, which are also talking a lot about, engaging the whole person and not just the head in the course of education, in the relationship to nature and modifying nature by, let's say, woodworking or carpentry or gardening, and so that's a good thing. It's a very good thing. And that book is definitely worth reading. Education at the Crossroads by Jacques Maritain. I found it long ago at a used bookstore, and I was really, really surprised it was so good because I've tried to read his books on poetry. I just can barely get through scholasticism and art, whatever it's called. I could hardly get through that one. And last but not least, my late friend. We weren't really friends. We were kind of acquaintances on via email. Stratford Caldecott, whose book Beauty in the Word is a really it's kind of a very similar to Maritain, but Stratford was open to things like Waldorf as well, and he's also kind of grounding it in a kind of reimagined trivium and quadrivium in his book. The sad thing about Stratford is when I found that book and a couple other things that he wrote, and I realized we were companion souls, and so I reached out to him, and we were corresponding quite a bit. And then he got cancer, and when he was sick, we were corresponding, and I was hoping he would get better because we were talking about getting together to do something about education, because Stratford had a lot of good theory going on, but he never was a teacher like I was, so he didn't have the hands-on practical experience of teaching, but he had great ideas, and we were going to do something, but he got sick, died, didn't happen, and I had to move on to other things, and the world moved on to other things too. Lately, if you've been following one of my books and stuff, I like this idea of a hedge school approach, which still, and you see it a little bit in this idea of micro colleges that are out there. And when I do these courses, like right now I'm doing a course on Shakespeare, pretty soon I'll be doing one on William Blake's Jerusalem. Those are great models for, well, you could probably do it for high school too, but for college and above. In fact, in those courses, I usually have people ranging in age from their 20s to their 70s. But with the hedge school model, which is based on the Irish hedge schools, where the Irish did not want their children educated in the British system. This is when Ireland was under the rule of Britain, so they set up rogue schools on the outside of the system, which I think that if there's going to be a future for Western humanity, that it's going to have to be an education that goes rogue, right? That and you actually, another place you saw this was in the American Transcendentalists, where they were setting up schools that were kind of outside the mainstream, and teaching, things that were worth learning, and they did not work from a. It was kind of interesting how we would have to think about whether I would call that a socialization model or a Rousseauian model or a classical model. I mean, it was very different. It was really a kind of cool thing if you want to look into it. But I think especially with younger children, and you probably see this a little bit in homeschooling, where it's kind of a hedge school, but it's not. From what I've seen, very often those co-ops are just more of an opportunity for kids to get together and hang out and meet other kids, rather than a serious engagement with things. Though I have done courses for kids here at my farm. I did one on Shakespeare. I did one on poetry once. You could do that. But what happened with the hedge schools in Ireland is people would get together and they'd hire a schoolmaster. Like people in a village would hire a schoolmaster and they would pay him. It was almost always a him, to educate their kids. And they would, and the parents, in kind of cooperation between what the schoolmaster could do and what the parents wanted, to decide what they would teach the kids. And it was very organic and flexible and plastic, where it might be, depending on where they lived, they might do, one of the things might be biblical Greek they would learn, or surveying or something, you know what I mean? It was really wide open. But probably in Irish hedge schools, the center was Irish language, Irish history, Catholic theology, as opposed to English history, Anglican theology, etc. Right? So those are the things I wanted to show you today, and I know there are a lot more. And if you have any suggestions, please do drop them into the suggestion box at the bottom in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe and give it a like. Share it with your friends, and we'll continue our conversation next time and I'll figure out what we're talking about. All right, take care.